Thanks. It's nice for once to have a talk that's at 310 in room 3010, so it's very hard to get confused over when and where. Almost the same. This talk's going to switch gears a little bit. I don't have a global flood forecasting system, but I'm going to report on some work to look into the inputs to hydrologic forecasting systems. I just want to mention my co-authors, Andy Newman and Martin Clark, who are also at RAL, and Levi Brekke from Reclamation, and Jeff Arnold from the Corps of Engineers, who's sitting in the room. Let's see. And a quick outline of the talk. I'll give some background on ensemble prediction in the US, which is a relatively new thing, and it provides some of the motivation for the study question. Talk about the study question itself and give a few results before the conclusions. Basically, in the US, in the last 5 to 10 years, there's been a lot of work to try to move from a kind of manual deterministic flood forecasting paradigm to an ensemble-based paradigm. And so there are two major methods that the RFCs, the River Forecast Centers of the US, are now using. One is called the GEFS, or Hydrologic Ensemble Forecast Service, which is made up of kind of a multi-component process that involves downscaling calibration of meteorological forecasts, theoretically in the future automated data assimilation, as well as streamflow post-processing, so a lot more than just models and forecast data being wired together to produce products. And the second one is the MMEFS, or Multi-Meteorological Model Ensemble Forecast System. This is a simpler system that's been rolled out in the eastern US, which really does a little bit more of just wiring together model outputs into, or NWP outputs into hydrology models. I'll give a little more info on each. Here's an example of the kind of forecast location distribution that you see in the River Forecast Center. So it's point forecast, it's not fully distributed. At a, probably not overwhelming density over the eastern US, but at enough locations to provide support for follow-on applications. In this MMEFS system, there are a number of different, I guess the most important thing is that there are a number of different forecast inputs. The GEFS is one set, as well as the North American Ensemble Forecast System, which also includes Canadian ensemble meteorological models, and the SREF, which is a sort of poor man's ensemble of a number of different models, control runs, I believe. And these go from short range about out to 7 days, and in some cases, I think, even out to 15. One key thing about these systems is that they're run in an automated fashion, which means that instead of forecasters manually producing meteorological inputs to the model, they actually just kick them off in a routine fashion without touching them first. So, and these are being communicated to partners. So they've reached a level of sort of operational acceptance. And the other notable thing is that there really is no downscaling in the system at all. The model outputs are just interpolated straight to the watershed centroids. So whatever biases or spread problems come out of the models are going straight into the hydrology models. Here's an example of a streamflow ensemble set that comes out of this system, and I invite everybody to take a look at some of these outputs just to get a feeling for kind of their quality. This you can see that with the thresholds for different impacts being given, it's now possible with these systems to actually estimate the risk of impacts rather than just take a guess from a deterministic forecast at what that risk might be. In the HEFS, it's a much different animal. It's a far more complicated system. It's being run mostly in the western U.S. where it was being developed, but is being rolled out in all river forecast centers. And this uses reforecasts, and many in the room may know what reforecasts are. I'll mention them a little bit more in the next slide. But it's different in principle because it also uses just not the full ensemble, but just the ensemble mean precipitation and temperature from the ensemble, and then rebuilds the spread in a way that I won't fully get into, but it's as part of this, it makes use of this, makes use of the fact that the reforecasts have a long multi-decade track record of past forecasts that can be paired up with observations to kind of estimate the deficiencies of the current forecast. And so this opens the door to a huge amount of training and calibration and verification that can be done on the current forecast. It's not possible with those forecast models that are being used in the MMEFS to sort of wire it up approach. This is data and graphics from Tom Hamill, but you can see that on the lower left, there's an indication that if you take the raw ensemble, the Breyer scores for skill are far lower than they are once you do a kind of a calibration step, which in this case is based on analogs. So that the RFCs recognize this, and they use a technique just basically regressing forecast means onto observations, although their first is a transformation to, let me see, this is upside down, I think, transformation to standard normal space before that relationship is built. And then there's one other wrinkle to this approach, which is to use a sort of multi-scale in time regression where a whole bunch of different forecast lead periods and durations are assessed for their skillfulness. And then the output ensemble is built from sort of the lowest correlation to the highest correlation pieces being layered over each other. It's actually quite elaborate, and it can produce, here's an example of a forecast I ran with the GEFS. It can actually produce relatively skillful forecasts at times, although the reliability might not be perfect. But in any case, this is still just using the ensemble, the NWP precipitation and temperature output, in this case either the ensemble mean or the full grids. And the concern I've always had with approaches like MMEFS, where you interpolate model outputs to a watershed, or that as you get into these areas of the country where we have tremendous terrain and climatological variability at the catchment scale, it's unclear that just interpolating is really going to work all that well, versus in the eastern U.S. where it's mostly been developed, it may actually do okay. Another kind of interest is to look at places where, if you look at the skill of the GEFS, and this is showing Breyer skill for precipitation over 10 millimeters, both the raw and the calibrated, using that hindcast to calibrate the forecast can certainly bring skill up to levels where this is like 0.1, 0.2, 0.3 in these areas where the raw forecasts have no skill. But nonetheless, the skill is still pretty low for things like precipitation. And so you can see it reflected when you do streamflow forecasts. This is from a report by James Brown in sort of the correlation. This is actually for precipitation. In California, you can see quite high correlations, lead times going, this is for I think a one-day lead time going out for different precipitation exceedances, whereas in Colorado, the correlations are only like 0.3 or so, and they drain off pretty fast. So that's another concern. Is there a way we can boost skill by, you hear a lot about data mining from these reforecasts. I mean, they have many other outputs other than precipitation and temperature. Can we go in and find other atmospheric variables that are in theory better predicted and then mine those for some more signal to add to our precipitation and temperature? So that's what we started out to look at. The approach we took was to run a code developed years ago by Martin Clark to use multiple variables in a kind of locally weighted regression framework for precipitation and temperature instead of just the main output variables, which are, let's see if I can go back, the main output variables, oh, there you can see all my results. Instead of just the main output variables, like accumulated precipitation at the surface for precip and temperature 2 meters for temperature. So we build a vector out of these different outputs from the model. We find analogs, and those analogs are used to generate sort of similarity weights to the current forecast, and then those similarity weights are used in the regression. It's a lot like a simple multiple linear regression, but you insert this sort of weight matrix so that the regression for any given instance or any given situation is trained on what are supposedly similar types of past events rather than the entire record. So it should recognize some regime differences in the record. So that's the technique. We have a big study basin set. It's actually 760 basins that Andy Newman set up around the country, but we've also sort of sub-selected for ones that flow into reservoirs to look at, and they're scattered across all the regions in the country. And so in this study basin set, we're looking at comparing just direct model outputs with this locally weighted regression approach. I'll just, because this is a short talk, just show a few results because they'll make the point that I found. One's a sort of high-scale basin, Colorado, and one's a lower-scale basin in Oregon. Or sorry, I said that reversed. We're looking at 11 member ensembles, a control run, 10 perturbations for 1 to 7 day lead times. And this is an example of basically what the temperature forecasts look like. And they're actually, this is for a 7 day lead, they're really skilled for the GEFS. I mean, you see a lot of that skill comes from the seasonal cycle, but even so, some of the sort of shorter range excursions are picked up. And this is for both the raw and the locally weighted regression. For precipitation, this is just another time series to give you a feeling for the way the data come out. There is an indication that GFS is able to pick up, say, dry periods and kind of wetter periods and get the amounts, the ranges about right. It's hard to discriminate between the two, whether all those extra variables and the analog weightings and everything gave us a boost as we hoped. And if you look at just even simple sort of ensemble mean scores like correlation and mean absolute error, they are very similar. I'd call it a wash. I don't think we got much of a boost at all from those extra variables. One thing I do note is that these skills are quite high relative to what we saw in the HEFS, which is very encouraging. It's even higher for the Roe River, where you see this is precipitation scores even at 4 or 5 days up in the 0.7 correlations. But in any case, and this just get to my last slide, we do find the main findings are that there really is substantial skill. It's very usable for hydrology. It's very encouraging. We didn't really get a benefit from these extra variables, and the question is why. It seems like maybe these systems that just use the primary outputs are going to work out okay, at least for now, until we understand how better to mine those extra variables. And in the future, we'll do some more scrutiny of this performance, and I'd just like to skip to also invited anybody in the room who happens to have some experience with this or maybe more sort of perspective on how we can better mine these atmospheric predictors to add to the raw NWP skill. I'd be happy to talk to you offline and perhaps collaborate. So thanks for your time.
We have time for one question. Nope.
For the Ver forecasts, do you think that all the methodology is fine? It's just we don't have the precipitation forecasts, or he can repeat it?
Yeah, I think the methodology is in a state of flux. I think where we have, as in a lot of hydrologic modeling and prediction, where you have good inputs, you will tend to get good outputs. And so I do think there are areas of the country, particularly in the Intermountain West and in the Midwest and places where convection dominates, where we really do need to work on trying to find better ways of deriving inputs to the models. And I mean, in the context of these global prediction systems, which the former speaker mentioned, are getting quite high dimensional and really are going to be dependent on inputs in areas where we don't have good verification. I think it's going to be a critical part of their development as well as this catchment scale development is going to be figuring out the best ways to get information out of the NWP and the climate forecasts. And so that's kind of what this talk was about. Thanks.